John Smith has been called one of the most famous and important avant-garde or experimental filmmakers going. To give you some idea if you've not heard of him, Smith's website features a passage from Adrian Danks, who describes Smith's work as transforming everyday things through words, associations, or camera angles. This is the toolkit every filmmaker possesses, by which he or she can manipulate his or her audience, altering their perception of something mundane or normal. By using a particular word or phrase, a particular combination of image and sound, or a particular style of photography, the filmmaker can turn something ordinary into something extraordinary. If you've ever had an emotional response to a movie, if you've ever cried at Titanic, for example, the filmmaker has hypnotized you, tricking your brain into responding as though what you're seeing is real. This isn't a criticism, not of the filmmaker nor of the audience. It's a neutral acknowledgement that film as a medium is manipulative. A filmmaker must elicit a response from his or her audience, whether it's a feeling of deep loss, of intense shock, or of pure laughter. The same logic applies if you've ever laughed at a reality show. For example, if you've ever laughed at someone's bemused reaction on an episode of Gordon Ramsay's Kitchen Nightmares, you might be laughing at something that didn't even happen. If you notice a cut between two camera shots, for example, if Gordon Ramsay's sitting in the restaurant yelling at his plate, and the camera changes to a shot of the chef's bemused reaction in the kitchen, then those two shots probably happened 20 minutes apart, and a trick of editing has exploited the humour of combining those two shots, making it appear as though they happened one after the other. Smith's website also states that his works playfully explore and expose the language of cinema, and another featured quote from Ian White calls Smith a maestro of deception, who instructs an understanding of film predicated on demystifying its oft-masked means of construction. If you've ever watched mentalist and illusionist Derren Brown explaining how he's performing a trick, for example when he exposes the psychology behind spirit cabinets, Ouija boards and seances in his show Seance, then this is basically what John Smith does with his films, but less directly. Smith educates his audience on the basic tricks that photography, sound design and editing can play on them, by playing those exact tricks on them, but in a humorous or unusual way that draws attention to itself, not unlike the style of humour used by Jim Abrahams and the Zucker brothers in movies like Airplane and Top Secret. Enter The Black Tower. On the surface, this 23-minute short film appears to be a psychological short story about a man being stalked by an ominous and foreboding tower that looms in the distance wherever he goes, driving him to paranoia before eventually consuming him. You'd be forgiven for assuming that the story, as it usually does, came first, and that the tower may have been superimposed into the shots. In this case, Smith's personal videography of the tower came first, and the story second. Having noticed the conspicuous, solid black Art Deco tower from numerous settings around his local area, Smith began to photograph it from a number of visually distinct angles, only threading the images together, after the fact, by weaving a narrative across them. In editing, he spliced his narration together with the footage, as well as a number of sound design and B-roll elements, and thus he'd created a compelling horror story, one that also functions as an avant-garde art project and an insightful experimental film. I'd like to briefly review the film before I begin to break down the tricks it plays. Smith's narration is engaging from start to finish, his calm and reassuring voice lulling the audience in and encouraging them to open their minds to the story that's being told. At first it's like listening to a really nice bedtime story. The prose is lovely, focusing on the little details that ground the story in reality, emphasising the banality of normal everyday life, which the tower's otherworldly presence stands out against. As the story goes on, the tower's presence becomes increasingly insidious as it follows the narrator everywhere he goes, forcing the narrator into isolating himself in his room. This culminates in an ambulance arriving to collect the narrator and take him to a hospital, on whose premises stands the tower. It's as if the tower has sent its minions to bring him to it. After the tower eventually consumes the narrator, a woman narrates the final minute of the film as she visits him in the cemetery and sees the tower herself. The cycle has begun anew. Looking at this film as a horror narrative, the titular Black Tower is comparable to something from the works of H.P. Lovecraft or the alternate reality website, the SCP Foundation, an object or entity that's beyond human comprehension and is both mundane and surreal in appearance. The film is also an excellent visual experience, Every shot of the tower standing against the skyline is gorgeous, with its symmetric framing, and perfectly lit by the sun so as to show off the unnatural blackness of its surface. In an interview with Carsten Wiesel, Smith described the tower as being like a hole cut out of the sky, and his videography of the tower illustrates this. I also noticed the shots of countryside scenery towards the end of the film, which seemed to be focusing on the impenetrable black spaces in between the trees and bushes. The tower standing over the cemetery where the narrator is buried at the end reminds of a headstone, marking the place where its latest victim was laid to rest. Now I'm going to turn into Morgan Freeman from Now You See Me, and explain some of the magic tricks the film plays on its audience. Some of these are obvious, but they're worth pointing out anyway. Let's start with the association sequence about 4 minutes into the film. After the narrator describes his first nightmare about the tower, a sequence of ominous noises and solid colour frames plays. Next, the sequence repeats, this time accompanied by narration of our protagonist's morning routine, recontextualising the noises and colours we've seen. Finally, the full sequence of events plays out for the third and final time. That ominous boiling noise and subsequent alarm was the narrator's tease made. That solid blood-red frame was just a close-up of a red jumper, and so on. Smith begins the sequence by giving his audience just enough information that they'll start to connotate what they're seeing and hearing with the foreboding nightmare he's just explained to them, letting their minds make the morbid associations he wants them to make. He then proceeds to explain in character what those noises and images were before playing them back in full, revealing to the audience the association trick which they've probably just fallen for. The film continues with an inspired editing sequence, in which trick after trick is deployed by the director. At one point the narrator describes how he was unable to read a damp newspaper because the text on the page was blending with the backwards reading text on the reverse side. As if to hammer the point home, his narration is accompanied by a secondary voice track playing in reverse, muddying the primary narration track and making it difficult to make out, like the words in the newspaper.
It had got very wet and the pages were stuck together. I found it very difficult to read as the reverse type on the back of each page was almost as clear as the front.
Shortly after this, the static shot of a field the film has been lingering on begins to change, as frames of the same field with a tower block standing over it sneak into the film. This happens a few more times until finally a full shot of the tower block being demolished is shown. Later, when the narrator begins to run from the Black Tower and describes seeing it wherever he goes, the edits of different shots of the tower are timed with the narrator's rapid footsteps. At any one time during this running section, there are only 2 alternating shots of the tower being cut between, which swap out occasionally for 2 new shots of the tower. Another association trick is used when the narrator hides from the tower in his room. Mariachi music begins to play. Then we're shown a shot of a pattern on the ceiling, which the narrator describes as a sleeping Mexican wearing a sombrero. In this case, the association trick is played on the narrator himself. It's as if he heard the music being played by the film, connotated it with Mexico, then associated the pattern on the ceiling with a Mexican man wearing a sombrero. The narrator remains hidden in his room for some time, and we're shown a view looking out of his window onto the street below, a view that's dominated by a darkly lit tree, standing centre frame. As the shot goes on and we see cars driving up and down the street, the cars begin to disappear behind the tree, passing by it from one side and never driving on from the other side, as if they've been consumed by the tree. It's no coincidence that the tree itself resembles the Black Tower, a tall, dark, monolithic shape that appears to spirit people away from our world. Finally, notice the abundance of black frames throughout the film. After the title card, the first thing we see is black, suggesting at first that there is no image during these parts of the film. From the moment the narrator describes his nightmare about the walls of the tower closing in on him, we begin to realise that these empty black frames might actually be close-up shots of the tower's walls. Obviously they're not really, but that's the implication, and as the film goes on we begin to see mostly black frames, in which a sliver of light can be seen in one corner, as if the tower is closing in. I'd say there are 3 main experiments in this film. The first is to illustrate the toolkit a filmmaker possesses using the aforementioned tricks of verbal and visual cues and mental associations. The second is to thread a narrative across various related and unrelated images, proving that a compelling story can come from anywhere, and that a compelling story can recontextualize the most mundane and unexciting things, encouraging the audience to have subjective thoughts on something as objective as a building. The third, then, is encouraging the audience to create their own interpretations and meanings by planting the seeds of themes and symbolism. These seeds will only grow if the audience engages with them. One possible theme is paranoia and mental illness. The narrator becomes increasingly paranoid to the point of isolating himself in his room for months, eventually being hospitalized for some time. Another theme is surveillance and institutional control. The tower is shown at various points to be standing on the grounds of a prison and a hospital, as well as in various places around the narrator's local area, following and possibly watching him in a manner that resembles the abundance of CCTV cameras we see in towns and cities today. Could the theme be rural or urban decay? In terms of rural decay, we see a tower block looming over an otherwise untouched field, and later see the Black Tower itself standing in what's supposed to be the countryside. In terms of urban decay, the tower block I just mentioned is shown being demolished, and when we see the Black Tower up close, its walls are weathered and worn down. None of these themes are spelled out to the audience, and might not have even been in the director's mind when he made the film. I believe it was his intent that the audience decides what this film means. I'd never watched an experimental or avant-garde film before The Black Tower. This short film opened my eyes to the approaches experimental can take, and I'd highly recommend checking out John Smith's website, johnsmithfilms.com, and his filmography, some of which is available to watch on YouTube. Thanks for watching, and please consider subscribing for more.